Started. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for the next round of our Promoting Independence for Life conference session. Today we are joined by Dr. Katie Herron, who is a research associate with the Early Childhood Center at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. So she's going to be talking to us about the importance of high expectations for families of children with disabilities and what the research says and what we should do. Before we begin though, I would like to thank our sponsors About Special Kids, Family Voices Indiana, Mass Mutual Midwest, and Shepherd's College. Our highlight sponsor today is Family Voices Indiana. So a big shout out to Family Voices. They have so many great resources. I encourage you to check them out. And you should also remember to visit our exhibit hall. You can get there at www.dsindiana.org/virtual-exhibit-hall. And all of our virtual exhibitors have information. There's contact information posted, and a lot of our exhibitors actually have a video that you can watch that tells you more about their organization, what you would typically see when you visited an exhibit hall. So thank you to all of those folks. And with that, we will go ahead and hand things over to Dr. Herron. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I will stop sharing, ma'am, and let you take over.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us over this lunch hour today. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. It's one of my favorite topics. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let me do that and make sure it works. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, good deal. All right. So today we're going to talk about high expectations for families of young children with disabilities. And I love this topic because it allows me to blend my, my persona as a researcher at IU and my personal experiences as a parent of a child with a disability. And so it's one of my most fun topics to talk about. And it's also something that I'm currently researching. So at the end, I'll share a little bit about a study that I'm doing. And if what we talk about today interests you and you'd like to dig a little bit deeper with me, you're more than welcome to reach out and we can see if you'd like to be part of the study. So before we go too much into what we're going to do today, I do want to tell you just a teensy bit about myself very quickly. Steph mentioned that I work at IU at the Early Childhood Center, which is one of multiple centers at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. So we're a research to practice group. So what we do is we look at the research and we say, all right, here's what it looks like is happening and how can we translate that into practices for our state that will help us to support families of children with disabilities as best we can. So the word young is in my title because I do work at the Early Childhood Center. What I focus on is 0 to 5. I will say though that if we have folks here that have older children or if you work with families that are all different ages, I think what we're going to talk about for the most part is you're going to find is pretty universal. So I think you're going to find that the research we talk about and the strategies we talk about are going to work for all families. I have a particular emphasis on the young children, and I think that starting early is going to be key, but it's going to translate. So having said that, from a personal perspective, I have a 19-year-old who has TAR syndrome, thrombocytopenia absent radius syndrome. So he was born missing his arms, also born missing ligaments in his legs, so uses a power wheelchair. He was diagnosed with autism as well as generalized anxiety disorder. So I've been his parent for 19 years. We've gone through lots of different systems and lots of different experiences. And so you'll see some of his pictures throughout this presentation, and I will refer to those experiences as well as the research as we go along. Okay. What I'd like us to accomplish today in the next however many minutes we have is to know what we're talking about when we talk about family expectations. We're going to give lots of examples. You're going to help me to generate those examples so that it gets really concrete. I think it's easy for terms to sound very I don't know, just general, and it helps to ground it in specific examples. So we're going to really understand the term. We're going to link between family expectations and outcomes. So we're going to talk about the research, not too much. Whoa, sorry about that. Not too much, but just enough so that you all have, you believe me when I say that there is a connection between expectations and child and family outcomes. All right. We're going to understand the role of professionals and families in forming and shaping expectations. And we're going to walk away with a couple strategies to try. And I will say that this is a presentation that I started doing this for early intervention providers. And what I've done is I've tweaked it a little bit for families, but I've left some of the things in here that I say to providers, because I want you to know what I say to providers so that you'll have a sense of what providers maybe could come to you with, or if they're not, what you could do to push those conversations a little bit on your end. So that's what the plan for today is. We're going to start out, I want this to be engaging. So I am going to share some research, but a lot of this is about you. A lot of this is about what your expectations are, how you think about your child's future. And so I really want us to have an engaging conversation. Oops, somebody already voted. I'm so excited. So I'm using Mentimeter today, and it's the first presentation I've done with Mentimeter, but I'm very excited to use it. So here's what we're going to do. If you're willing to try a new thing, go to www.menti.com. You'll see it at the top of the screen. And you can do this on another browser, like another window on your computer. You can also do it on your phone. You can just go to Chrome or whatever browser you use on your phone and type in www.menti.com. And when you type it in, you'll see a place where it says to enter your code. And you'll just put in the code that's at the top of the screen, 169175. All right, we got 2 people who figured it out. You guys are fast. And this is an easy question to get us started. How old is your child with a disability? Just so we have a sense of who's with us today. Oh, you guys are getting it. That's awesome. Like I said, you can do this on your phone. You can do it on an iPad. You can also do it on the same computer you're Zooming on. You can just put Zoom over here and then open another browser. And we're going to use this throughout the presentation. So if you don't want to use it, that's totally fine. In fact, I have, let me make sure I have, where's my chat? Here's my chat. I have the chat open as well, and Steph's going to help me watch the chat, and I will watch the chat also. So if you don't want to mess with it, in fact, I see, thank you, I've got 2 people in the chat, 4 and 11, in terms of ages. It's more than fine to just go ahead and use the chat. So we've got a very colorful graph here. It looks like we've got some equal numbers in the 3 to 5 range. I'm going to add in 1 from chat. So that's 4 in the 3 to 5 range, 3 in the 5 to 10 range, and then I'll add in 1 from chat. So 4 in the 10 to 18 range. Okay, that's great. Like I said, while I might talk a little bit more about early childhood here, I don't think you're going to hear a whole lot that isn't relevant to the age of your kiddo. So. And I imagine a lot of you probably do support work with other families as well. Oh, okay. Thank you. All right, so we're going to keep going. All right, rather than give you a really boring academic definition of expectations, I would like us to generate our definition of expectations before we start in on the research and our strategies. So I want you to think for a minute about what future expectations your parents had for you. Doesn't matter if they said it directly, doesn't matter if it was modeled for you, but you have a sense of what your parents expected from you. And I'd like you to use Menti and put up here some of the things that, that you knew were expectations. Okay, so we've got a couple. Be happy, get good grades, be successful, make lots of money, be a doctor. Wow, those are some hard expectations. Be kind, help others, be happy, higher education on full scholarship. So some of these are very specific. Yeah, good citizen, go to college, make good decisions. We've got a really nice mix here of ones that are harder to measure but are more about what kind of a person you are. And then we've got others that are very concrete, right? In terms of, I mean, you've got some really specific ones here, not just go to college, but go to college on a full scholarship, or make a lot of money and be a particular, have a particular career. Let me see if I can, oh, there we go. I can move these down so we can see. Go to college, get a job, support yourself, get married and have children. A lot of really different expectations. But I also see some patterns. Okay. While you're entering these, think also about how these were communicated to you. Is this something that your parents sat down and said, hey, I expect you to be a good citizen. Hey, I expect you to get married and have children. Or were those things communicated in indirect ways? Because we're going to talk about why expectations are important, but then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about why they're important. And so start thinking now about how these things got communicated to you. Okay, thank you for those who entered something. I appreciate that. Now we're going to do something a little bit different. I want you to tell me what your future expectations are for your children. So we're going to use the same Menti, and you're probably typing, but we're same Menti, same code. There we go. To have friends. Yeah. Meaningful relationships, valued member of their community. Absolutely. So there's religion. That's a huge expectation for some families. Build a life that makes them feel happy and fulfilled. Career that they're happy with. Oh, I see happy a lot on here. Be a good person, pay their bills, be happy. Contribute back to society in some way. These are wonderful. How many of you have thought about this? I have to imagine you've thought about this before today, because these are very well thought out. Do you all know how if you click on the participant tab at the bottom of Zoom, do you all know how to raise your hands? If you click on the participant tab and then go down to the bottom, there's a place where you can raise hands. That's another way that we can communicate with one another. So I'm curious, how many of you have thought about what your expectations are for your child prior to today? My guess is most people have. I mean, when we're pregnant or adopting or whatever it is, when we're expecting a child, we are already forming what we think that child's life will be like, right? A lot of them are, a lot of our expectations are based on things that our parents expected for us. So some of these things here are similar to on the first page. Some of them are different though. Sometimes our expectations are different. Sometimes the presence of a disability when our child is born or as our child grows can shift what our expectations are. So I just want us to kind of keep these front and center as we're talking today. And it may be that you'll have some shifts as well in terms of your expectations as we go along. Yeah, Jacqueline, it is only allowing one answer. I think I said it that way. I probably should have said it to let you guys answer more. But these are great, and these give a really nice range. All right, we're going to keep going. One more question. I promise I'm actually going to give you some information. I'm not just going to ask you questions the whole time. You probably feel like you're being interviewed. But one more question for you. Where do your expectations come from? So when you just put all those beautiful expectations on the last page for your children, where are those expectations coming from? This is one where you're probably going to wish you had more than one box to write. So you can put multiple things in the one box you have if this only lets you do one answer. Did they come from your parents? Did they come from the media? Did they come from your church? Okay, so expectations come from scriptures, come from your own upbringing. My assumption that my child is capable, ooh, I like that. We want our child to leave a legacy. Values, own life experiences, conversations with partner, looking back on other family members' history. Very nice. Yeah. I see faith is important. Multiple ones here. Evaluating my life and wanting the same or better for my kids. So some people are saying, you know, where I'm looking back on what was expected of me, and then others are saying, I'm also evaluating how that went and what my life is now and what I want to be the different for my kids, the same or different. Yeah. And maybe you haven't thought about it before, and it's hard to know where your expectations come from. There's so many different ways that we can be influenced. I mean, imagine if we did this presentation in Japan, right? Or Saudi Arabia, or pick any country. You're going to even see different expectations just based on culture, right? And societal values, as well as the family values you grew up with. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it. We'll do this a few more times as we go along. I wanted to share throughout this some quotes from the study that I'm doing. And this quote makes sense here because we're talking about where expectations come from. And this family member said, you can get caught up or you can get real smart about which voices get in. The voices that are in have high expectations for my son. They expect our family to function normally. We aren't treated as if something is broken. So as we think about what our expectations are and what influenced those, we want to make really sure that the things that are influencing our expectations are the things that we want to influence our expectations, right? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the research. I promise that we won't go into horrible detail and things, but I want to give you some research basis for why it's important for us to talk about this and why it's important for your providers to be talking with you about this. I'm going to start with the inspirational quote, and then we'll get into the actual research studies. You all have seen this poster on walls. They used to be really popular in the 90s, early 2000s. Nobody rises to low expectations. We know this. It's just one of those gut things, right? All right, it's a gut thing, but it's also a real thing. So when we talk about family expectations, we know that they impact outcomes, and that's regardless of disability. So when we look at studies of typical families with typical children, what we know is that if the families have high expectations for particular outcomes, usually academic outcomes have been measured, but they have looked at some other things, those things tend to happen. Whereas if families have lower expectations, then those things are less likely to happen. Now, if you're a researcher person, you might think that there are a whole lot of other factors that could be at play here, and that's true. There are other factors that could be at play, but there have been studies that have weeded out those other factors and still found that family expectations have an impact on outcomes. Now let's talk specifically about families of children with disabilities. What we know is that family expectations become even more important for children with disabilities. And I'm not going to be shocking anyone when I share that children with disabilities tend to have lower rates of things that we want, like diploma attainment, participation in post-secondary education or training programs, employment. We know this, right? We're very aware of this. So that's why it becomes even more critical that families play a role in helping their children have high expectations, because those high expectations are more likely to be met. So the studies tell us, multiple studies have told us that when family expectations are high, that is predictive of post-school outcomes. And in case you're wondering, even controlling for school performance and the actual functioning of the child. So you might think, well, sure, it's easier to have high expectations if your child has a relatively minor thing going on, or higher this functioning or that functioning. Even controlling for that, we see an association between our expectations for our children and what they achieve. So, sorry, I still have the academic references on here just in case anybody wants them. There are citations at the end as well. I'm assuming you're probably not going to want to go and look up the papers, but just in case, they're here. One of the researchers that is well known in this area said, research indicates that when the influential people in a child's life do not believe that he or she has potential to achieve an outcome, it's unlikely that the outcome will be realized. So that's kind of the research in a nutshell. But let's talk about why this is. I mean, why do family expectations, separate from performance and functioning, why do family expectations impact outcomes? I mean, what would be the pathway that would make that happen? Well, there's a study done by Yamamoto and Holloway that put together a very nice logic model for this. And this is something that I just want us to look at from a theoretical perspective in terms of how this might be happening. So let's start over on the left. So let's say we have very high family expectations. He uses parental expectations, so that's why I have that on there. Let's say we have high family expectations for our child. That can translate into multiple actual behaviors, right? It can translate into us being really motivated to communicate those expectations to our child, right? We're going to try to get our child pumped up. If we think they have the potential to achieve a particular outcome, we're going to be asking them about it and talking about how exciting it is. We're going to be working with that child to get that child excited and motivated. It's also likely that if we have high expectations, we're going to be working with that child around the self-sufficiency. So if they need to be able to do certain things to achieve a certain outcome, we're going to be working with that child to get them to that point. Also, we're going to be more involved. I mean, it's just human nature, right? If we think there's a really good chance that a child is going to reach something, then we're going to throw ourselves into it, and we're going to help them, and we might do extra work with them. We might volunteer in the classroom, or we might take them, be willing to drive them to specific places to do specific things because we know that that'll matter. We might talk more with our teachers. We might influence the teachers' expectations. If our teachers that are our early education providers, our early intervention providers, if they know that we have really high expectations, that's going to influence the way they look at our child. I mean, it's just, again, it's just psychology. If they see that child from that strength-based view that we're looking at that child through, it's going to influence how they look at that child as well, and consequently how they then act, behave, and what they expect from the child. All of these things can contribute to academic success. One that isn't on here, but I think is also important, is where do we send our child? So if we have high expectations for our child's academic success, and there's lots of ways that, things besides academic success, as you all pointed out when you talked about your expectations a minute ago. But in this study, he talked about academic success. If we have high expectations there, where are we going to place our child? What classroom are we going to place our child in? What environment are we going to place our child in? It's likely that we're going to make a choice, a different choice, if we think our child has a strong academic future, or we think we want our child to go to college, or whatever it is, versus if we have very low expectations in that area. So you can see that it's not just thinking good thoughts. It's about how those good thoughts, those high expectations, then translate into the things we do with our child, with our child's teachers and providers, with pretty much everyone in our child's life, right? All right. So I want you to think for just a second, how do expectations change how parents act? In particular for you, how do the expectations that you have for your child influence what you do with your child? Well, you guys are really thinking. You're thinking and you're typing. I'm more likely to advocate for my child if I expect them to succeed. Absolutely, absolutely. Causes me to focus on the cans rather than the can'ts. So it's almost about where you put your energy, where literally, I mean, both things exist, but you're choosing to focus on the cans. I like that. How much I hold her accountable. Yeah, so how you actually interact with your child, kind of like this picture here, you know, it looks like the dad's talking to the daughter. How do you actually interact with your child around what you expect from them? More thoughtful with my time, my words, and instruction. Everything is a learning moment. Yeah. I'm more likely to be more or less engaged in a particular activity if I have the expectation that my child will be successful. That is absolutely right. And we have research that supports that. If we expect that something isn't going to work, we're much less likely to be engaged in working with our child to have that happen. Low expectations create low standards and vice versa. Absolutely. They change everything. Yeah. Parents I work with are more involved in services when they have higher expectations and believe they will succeed. Yes. Fight hard for them by educating people around us about how we talk about my child and what's different about him. Oh, I love that. Yes. Be extremely selective about who we receive wisdom and counsel from. Yes. These things matter. And the way that we're thinking about our child's future, then we're making different choices. You all have just given multiple examples of the choices that you're making. And I mentioned teachers earlier because that was an academic study, but I love how somebody said, you know, it just influences how we talk about my child and what's different about him. Just the words you're using. And we're going to talk about strength-based language in a little bit, but absolutely. I hold myself more accountable to make sure that she learns all the needed skills to be the absolute best she can be into adulthood. Yeah. You put more into it if you believe that you're going in a particular direction and that you have a chance of being successful. Absolutely. Thank you. Those are awesome. Okay. So I told you earlier that it doesn't matter how old your kiddo is, that this stuff is gonna apply across the board. I will say though that there's a reason that I'm focusing on expectations in early childhood. And that's because most of the research on this topic has been done in the period in high school transitioning to college or post-secondary, whatever. Most of the research has happened there because that's kind of where what do you say, metal hits the road? What is that saying? Something hits the road. That's where things get real, right? Where people are like, okay, high school's about to be over. What are we going to do? We have to start talking about this. But that's not when expectations are formed. We don't suddenly in high school form expectations. It may be that our expectations have been shifting all along and continue to shift in high school, but that's not where they come from. They're formed earlier. They're formed much earlier. And the other good thing to know about this is that expectations can be changed. So expectations are not something where you have them and they're just like that forever. If we are exposed to new information and new ideas, we can shift our expectations. So if we know that there are possibilities out there that we previously didn't know about, that can change what we hope for. I'll talk about family-to-family support in a little bit, and obviously you all are on board with family-to-family support because you're here and you're part of this conference and this organization that is all about family support. So I don't have to preach to the choir on that one. But what I will say is that, as an example, when my son was born, you know, he was born without arms, and my husband and I had no experience with this and had no idea how he was going to eat, how he was going to this and that. I remember we became very focused on how he would ever eat a hamburger. I don't know why that was important, but we became very focused on that. And it was very hard to imagine. And as you all know, because I know you know the power of family connections, we fell into a Yahoo group. This is going to date me. Yes, it was 19 years ago. It was a Yahoo group at the time, but we found this little tiny group of families that had the same condition that Ben did. And they sent videos of their children doing things. And suddenly I had a video of a 10-year-old swimming in the pool. And I had a video of a young child sneaking across the floor, even though he couldn't walk, but he was, you know, crawling across the floor in order to steal something when his mom wasn't looking. And suddenly I could picture it. And that shifted my expectations. just through that new information. So it's important that we think about this stuff. Rubber meets the road. Thank you, Megan. I'm terrible with, I always try to throw those out and then I never get them right. Rubber meets the road. Makes sense. Rubber on a tire. All right. Thank goodness for the chat. Okay, you guys. So what can we do to promote high family expectations? This is where I am going to share some strategies that I share with early intervention providers. And I want you to know what I say to them because I want you to know what to listen for. I'm hoping that when you go back to your providers that you'll want them to ask you some of these questions and you'll want them to do some of these things and that you can kind of push a little bit and prod a little bit and see if you can make some of those things happen if they're not happening already. The very first thing I say to early intervention providers is ask a lot of questions. So look at some of these questions. What are your hopes and dreams for your child? What do you hope to see your child doing in 1 year, kindergarten, high school, as an adult? It might be very hard if your child is 3 for you to imagine what their life might be like as an adult, but you all just did it. We just did it a couple slides ago, right? And yeah, you're not picturing it exactly, but you know that you want them to be happy or live independently or have religion as part of their life. You know some of those things. When you think about what your child's life will be like, what's most important to you? And then the magic wand question, if you could wave a magic wand and see the future, what would you picture your life looking like? Anything to help people start to picture what's important to them. And so for you, I want providers to ask you these questions, but if they don't, you can still share some of this information with your provider. You can kind of force some of these conversations to happen. So I'm curious, have you had conversations about future expectations with professionals, with early intervention providers, or if your child is older, with school people? Have they asked, you know, what do you want? What are your hopes and dreams? What do you want your child to be like when they're older, when they're grown, when they're 5 years down the road? Oh, I'm so happy to see all the yeses. That's wonderful. Amazing. I'm so glad to hear that you're having these conversations. Yeah, that's okay. It was 19 years ago for me. I can't remember either. Yeah, great. Okay, good. So you're having some conversations on these topics. That's amazing. I'm curious, I gave some example questions in the last slide, and I know timing wise, we have to keep motoring here, but I did want to give you the opportunity, if you've had somebody ask you something that's been most helpful or most encouraging, has there been that one question that's really made a difference for you? And if there has, I just thought you could share it here because sometimes it's helpful for other people to hear that. That one question that kind of stopped you in your tracks and made you reevaluate. All right, I know you may be typing or, okay, I've got a couple here. What do you imagine their future spouse is like? Oh, that's interesting. Huh, that's interesting. Never heard that one before. How interesting. Writing our vision statement for IEP. Okay, so that was helpful for you. Nice. I like that. I don't want to cut people off. I'm just going to give it another second here and then we'll keep going. So you just had some reassurance. We had some people tell us he's going to be amazing, he's going to be fine. Just the reassurance can be huge. Sometimes you just have to be given permission to dream, right? That, you know, given permission that it's going to be okay, which can free you up to then think, oh, well then I can hope for this and I can hope for that. Expect competency. Yeah. If these were meaningful for you, it's likely they would be meaningful for other people. So consider, if you work with other families or even just interact with other families, sharing some of these things. I know I have a few things that came to me in various points across my son's life that have stuck with me verbatim. And those are things that we need to share. And then somebody says it's the questions I haven't been asked and the assumptions that other people have made that have made me consider it. That's pretty huge too. Sometimes we don't get asked these questions or have these conversations. Or people assume, yeah, absolutely. And then sometimes assumptions can beat us down, but other times assumptions can kind of get our back up, right? And make us want to show people that their assumptions are false. So that's an excellent point. All right, I'm going to keep going. Sorry, I don't want to cut anyone off, but I want to make sure we get through everything. Ask myself what kind of job she might want to do. I love that. Yeah, and someone else, another family member I was talking about just thinking about based on what they like now, what might be a good trade or job or skill set for them down the road. And just those little things, they start to make it real, right? And we need to be real because some of our expectations earlier, they were all excellent and lovely and they were general, and it makes sense that they're general because we don't know. But sometimes it's a fun little exercise to try to get a little more specific, just because sometimes that can help you to clarify in your head some of the things that really are important. So thank you for sharing that. Here's something that a family member shared. They said, no one has ever talked to me about these things. I don't want to fall through the cracks because nobody is asking me these questions. So I'm pleased to hear that most of you have had some of these conversations with the professionals in your lives. I think that's great. Some families aren't having them, and they have this sense that they should know more or be thinking about other things, but they're not necessarily being guided, and it can make them somewhat anxious, as this family expressed. All right. So in addition to asking questions, I tell professionals to listen. Seems very basic, but let me tell you the research behind it. What we know is, and this is from school-age kids, so this isn't early intervention, what we know is that most conflicts between parents and professionals occur when there's a disconnect between the parents' views of their child and the professional's views. This is probably not surprising to any of you. Am I right? This is something that I would imagine is true for early childhood, and I imagine it's true for post-secondary as well. If we have a fundamental difference of opinion with the professional that's working with our child and our family around what we're working towards, we're going to have conflict. And so what I would encourage you to do is listen to what your providers are telling you, what your professionals are saying about what they expect for your child, because it's important that you understand what your provider's viewpoints are, and so that you can identify if there's a disconnect and perhaps realize that you need to share what your views are, right? They need to know where you're trying to get, and you need to make sure that it matches up. So just something to think about if you haven't had that conversation. So real quick, just to ask, have you had a conversation with the professionals working with your child about your expectations and their expectations? So you can say yes, no, or we've talked about one or the other, but not both. Oh, you guys, you've got, I have a feeling we've got some wonderful advocates on this call, and that makes me very happy. And it sounds like you've got some excellent providers as well, where most of you are having that conversation, not only about what your expectations are, but their expectations as well. That's awesome. Yeah. And then some of you have talked about one, but not both. So if you're in the group that's talked about one, but not both, maybe think about, is there a way to have that conversation? Because we don't have to wait for providers to bring that up. We can bring that up, right? And we can ask. You know, I was just thinking the other day, thinking about what things are going to be like down the road, and these three things are really important to me, and I was just curious, do you ever think about that? And if so, what do you see for my child down the road? Might be a really interesting conversation. All right. Next thing I say to providers, professionals is to withhold judgment. And this first bullet here is probably the only thing that might differ between early childhood and maybe your transition years. So I feel strongly that there's not a huge need to be realistic when children are very young. I think that expectations should be high, and it's okay for you to hope and dream for things that may or may not materialize, because hopes and dreams, as we talked about, expectations change, they shift, they flow. And so you may shift and flow over the years as your child grows up and you learn more about them. But starting with high hopes and dreams I don't think is a bad thing. And what I find is that professionals sometimes are very concerned about you being realistic, about families being realistic. And sometimes that can lead to young children, let's think about a typical child. Typical child might walk around for a year in their preschool years saying they want to be a ballerina or a ninja or an astronaut or something that is fairly unlikely to actually materialize. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it's pretty unlikely. And we don't come to those children and say, oh, you're never, it's really hard to be a ballerina. Maybe you could just dance for fun, or, we don't say that to typical children, but there's a tendency to want to say something like that to children with disabilities or families of children with disabilities. The need to temper expectations. Don't dream too high. Oh, that might be a lot. That stuff's going to come out in the wash. It's very rare that an 18-year-old still wants to be an astronaut or a ballerina or a ninja, right? Those things shift naturally. Same with family expectations. But there is some research suggesting that allowing parents to wish and have positive expectations is a positive coping strategy. Now, if you're a parent that you don't find it helpful or positive to dream big and know that you might have to shift that a little bit over time, that's okay. People are different. But I would just encourage you to think about letting kids dream big. This is my son, by the way. I think I showed him earlier too, and I didn't tell you it was him, but this is him probably at about 5. I think this was his first day of kindergarten. And he, at that time, wanted to be a fire alarm inspector, a Broadway musical star, and a best-selling author. Those were his things, and he was planning to do them simultaneously. And that's fine. And you know what? He's 19 now, and he's a geography major, and he's not planning to do any of those things. It just comes out in the wash. But I hope that nobody ever told him that he couldn't be a Broadway star because he was in a wheelchair. So withhold judgment. Withhold judgment for providers and for you guys. Maybe withhold judgment a little bit on yourselves as well. And this is, let me see at the time. You know what? I'm going to skip this one because we've got a little ways to go and I want to make sure we get through these slides. How many of you, let's see, first of all, if everyone could go under the participant tab and lower your hand. Whenever you hit raise hand, it stays up until you unraise your hand. If you don't mind going in and unraising your hand. And then I'm curious, how many of you have heard of the life course tools? If you don't mind raising your hand now, if you've heard of the life course tools. Well, I was really pleased to see, I see some of you have, yeah, a lot of you have, awesome. I was really pleased to see that Heather Danes, I'm pretty sure it was Heather, is going to be doing something on the life course as part of this conference, because I love the life course tools. I think that if you're interested in thinking more about future expectations, this is an amazing set of tools to use. And the website is up here, but I encourage you to join Heather's if there's still space and hear what she has to say about it. I'm showing one particular tool that I love, but there's lots of tools that are part of this life course framework. And so feel free to check it out if you want to. But I love this trajectory worksheet. And I love it because it visually shows what we've been talking about so far. And I have a quote from Gloria Steinem on here just because I think it relates to this worksheet and what we've been talking about. I've said before that dreaming is a form of planning. So when we talk about our dream, let's be sure we also discuss the steps we can take to make it real. So it's one thing to dream, right? It's one thing to say, I want this, this, and this when my child is older. But we have to make sure that the steps we're taking are taking us in that direction, right? And so this form that you can find on the website has this first box, vision for a good life. This is where we write those expectations that you guys put early on in this presentation. Be happy, find a job that they like, get married and have children, you know, have religion in their life, whatever it is, that's where you would put that here. And if that's hard, if that's really hard, start with this box down here where it says what I don't want, because sometimes it's easier to say what you don't want than what you do. So start there. Say, I don't want him to be lonely. I don't want her to live with us forever. Hey, I mean, maybe some people do, but it's okay to say that maybe you don't, whatever it is. So sometimes you have to start with what you don't want before you can envision what you do. But once you fill that out, the important thing is this black line. Every decision you make should be taking you towards the good life and not towards what you don't want. And it's really hard to make decisions if you don't know where you're going. So maybe it's not when your child's an adult. Maybe that seems so far away and so hard and so overwhelming to think about. Maybe it's just when your child's in kindergarten or when your child's in middle school. I mean, pick something that you can feel comfortable digging into, and then make sure that the choices you're making are taking you there. So if you're about to transition out of First Steps into something, think about what you want your child's preschool experience to look like. What children do you want them to be around? What do you want the teacher to be like? What do you want the school to be like? Think about, envision it, and then think about what you don't want. And then make sure that the decisions you're making during your transition planning as you leave First Steps are taking you towards what you want. And that might be whether, maybe you're thinking about inclusion versus not inclusion. Maybe you're thinking about Head Start versus developmental preschool. There might be all kinds of choices, and you want to make sure that they're taking you on the pathway. All right, anyway, I could talk about this for a long time, but luckily there's a whole other webinar about it. So we're going to keep moving. I want to share really quickly, this is in some of Brene Brown's work, but it's based on some research by Snyder and colleagues. Hope, I think, is very related to expectations. If you don't have hope, you're not going to be able to have high expectations for your child. So hope has three components according to this research. You have to have a goal. That's what we've been talking about, right? You have to know where you're going, but you also have to have the pathway. You have to know what your pathway is to get to where you want to be. And then finally, you have to have agency. Now, my guess is you all have a lot of agency. You've connected with other families. You're doing webinars. You're educating yourself. But it's important because you can have a goal and you can even see how to get there. But if you feel hopeless, if you feel overwhelmed, if you're depressed, if you feel like you lack capacity, then it's still going to be hard. You have to have all three. So I could talk for another hour about self-care, because if you don't have self-care, agency's tough. So take care of yourselves. The other thing I like about the life course is this idea that it talks about all the different parts of life. So, you might do a study and it only talks about academic success. Academic success is not everything about your child's life. What about religion? What about social connections? What about friends? What about jobs? So many other things in life. And this family from my study made that point very nicely. She said, I don't think we talk enough about the future, hardly at all. We haven't had a lot of conversations about the future beyond talking about transition to preschool. Nobody's talking to me about, is my son going to have hobbies? Is my son going to be able to take a vacation? Is my son going to be able to understand birthday celebrations? So the bigger picture. Okay, I'm going to go pretty quickly here because I know I'm running out of time. I encourage providers to consider implicit bias. I know a lot of people talk about implicit bias lately related to race, but there's implicit bias related to disability as well. The Harvard implicit bias test, you can check that out. Just Google Harvard implicit bias test. I took it when my son was maybe 10. I had been an advocate. I had been a trainer. I had been doing this work. And I have an implicit bias to people with disabilities. So it doesn't have anything to do with how much you love your child. It doesn't have anything to do with anything other than our society and the culture that we're raised in teaches us from a very young age to value some people over others. And so if you're curious, you can check that out. But I encourage providers to explore that. We've talked a little bit about language already, but I want to raise it because I think it's very important. I tell professionals that they need to focus on the things that the child is doing well. This does not come naturally to families or professionals, and that is because our systems are set up for you all to have to focus on the weaknesses and the delays and the diagnoses in order to get into the system. So the way that you get into First Steps, the way you get into voc rehab, the way you get into the school system is by showing what your child is not doing well. What I encourage you to think about is think of it as a game you play. You show those things so that you can get in the door, and that's the price of admission once you're in. Total about face, strength-based language. Somebody said earlier, I choose to focus on the cans versus the can'ts. Well, you talk about the can'ts to get into the system. Once you're in the system, it's all about the cans. And I used to do a thing with professionals where I would do two different descriptions of my son. I would do one written like a report where it focused on all the deficits, and then I would do one written from strength-based language. And I would ask them which child they would rather work with and what they expected that child to be able to do in the future. And of course, they always thought that the one that had been described in strength-based language would do better in the future, and they would be more excited to work with them, think that they would do better. All right, so probably not a surprise. I encourage providers to point out progress, even if the child's delayed. So you all should be doing the same thing. You can train yourself to do the same thing. And strength-based language, there's been a lot of controversy around language and disability, and we don't have time to get into it. There's identity first language and people first language. What I tell providers is start with people first language because it's strength-based language. If at some point down the road, the family or the child chooses to identify in a different way, then you go with what the family and the child prefer. But if the provider comes in using strength-based language, then again, it shifts. Our language influences the way we think. So this is a quote from a family. It says, the reports I get, I'd rather not see them. They don't help me think about my child's future. They feel heavy, and it's the positive reactions I focus on. So again, choosing to focus on the cans versus the cans. We talked a little about transition already, but I encourage professionals to offer all options. It's very tempting for professionals to decide where they think a child should go and focus on that option. So what I would say to you as family members is make sure that you are hearing all of the options and that you are asking for all of the options. Make sure that you ask, what else could we do? Just to hear it. You might not choose that way, but you need to know what your choices are. What we know from the research is that when parents are given multiple options, they're more likely to choose the more inclusive option. If they are only told about developmental preschool, then, surprise, surprise, that's where they'll go. It's really important to know all the different possibilities. I do honestly, personally, I think inclusion is the way to go if at all possible. Everyone gets to have their own opinion on that. But what the research has showed us is that when parents are encouraged to segregate their children, in other words, not go into an inclusive environment, we know that parents then lower their expectations. So if you think about that pathway on the trajectory, right? And if your pathway is to college or to being fully included in third grade or whatever it is, if you segregate in preschool, is that on the pathway to where you want to be, or is that taking you to where you don't want to be? Just make sure that you kind of think through all the options that are presented. This is a parent talking about transition. They say, transition was hard. I feel like there were two distinct camps. Our therapist said one thing. The school system said something different. At the time, I had a newborn and was homeschooling my third grader. I didn't have the capacity to analyze the two distinct camps and figure out what to advocate for. So we just started with the services the school was offering. Was I wrong? So there's a lot of mom guilt, the parent guilt that can go into these decisions. And so first things first is you're making your best choice. And so of course this mom was not wrong, but she was overloaded. She didn't have the capacity at the time to really weigh all of her options. And that can be very challenging. I'm going to keep us moving because we are almost out of time. So I'm not going to take time to do that poll. I don't need to tell you about facilitating parent-to-parent connections. I know you know the value in that. The two links that I have on here that you might want to go Google are one, the Pacer Center, www.pacer.org. They have a series of transition videos that are done by people with disabilities and parents with disabilities that talk about expectations. And remember when I talked about how important it was for me to see videos of an older child like my son? These are some great videos of older people with disabilities and what they've experienced as they've gone through transition. You might enjoy those. The other one is Disability Finder. You're probably aware of it. In fact, I believe you might have a presentation, or at least they're in your exhibit hall, I can't remember, on this, but it's a great resource. If you haven't checked it out, I would encourage you to do that. I bet you know all the other parent-to-parent connections out there, so I took a lot of those off. And I tell providers to talk about the power of expectation. And so for you, I say, know the power of expectation. Know that your beliefs are hugely impactful. And it's a wonderful thing because we do so much work for our children. And isn't it wonderful to know that just by believing in them and thinking about their future and being excited about their future, that truly makes a difference in their trajectory and where they end up. I think it's inspiring and exciting, and I hope that you do too. I wanted to share the study, the flyer for my study that is currently going on. It involves an hour-long interview with me talking about this stuff. And then it also involves hopefully observing an IFSP or an IEP meeting, if that's possible. Everything's done virtually at this point, so it would be observing virtually. And if that's not possible, then that's okay, but we do it if we can. And then trying to talk to one or two of your providers as well, an interview with them. So we can pay $30. It's a check for your participation. And if you're interested, you can email me, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. But at this point, I think I have maybe 2 minutes left. I think we talked a lot throughout, but I will take questions for a minute or two here at the end, if anyone has them. Steph, did I miss anything in the chat? Am I good?
No, I think you kept up with it well.
Okay, good. I had it kind of down at the bottom, so I ran off. Jacqueline, we can definitely do a self-care webinar. You betcha. Oh, goodness. Well, I'm sorry I went a little fast at the end. This is the first time that I had added in some of the Mentimeter stuff. I thought that was kind of fun. If you guys have thoughts on that, let me know, because that's the first presentation I've used that with. I really enjoyed reading your responses. But so any final questions? If you have questions after the fact, feel free to send me an email. It doesn't just have to be about the study. You're welcome to email me about anything on this topic. Like I said, I do enjoy talking about it. And just while we're finishing up, I will go to my last slide which is my citations. I know nobody really wants these, but I feel like I should show them. So there they are. I really appreciate that everybody took the time out of their Tuesday midday to join in.
This has been really, really great. Would it be possible for us to get like a copy of your citation list?
Yeah, sure. In fact, I kind of missed the part where I was supposed to send you slides a week ahead of time, so I apologize for that. I could certainly send along either a PDF of my PowerPoint or just the citations, whichever.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be amazing.
Sure, happy to.
And if anybody on here is interested in getting a copy of those slides, just shoot me an email or message me and let me know, and I'm happy to email those to you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. This has been like amazing and inspiring, and I know several mamas on here who are getting ready to go through their first IEPs who have probably found this really empowering. So thanks.
Oh, I could do a whole other webinar on IEPs. Yeah, Take all this stuff in with you. Like, go into that IEP with that expectation at the front of your head. Bring a picture of where you want your kid to be. If your child isn't with you, bring a picture of that child and be the first one to talk. It's hard, but like, be the first one to talk. Just say something positive about your child at the very beginning.
Absolutely.
A whole other topic, but it's yeah, take those expectations into that meeting with you.
Absolutely. And we've got a comment in the chat box saying this has been it's helpful to relay this to my husband because our views are kind of opposing. So that is, I think that's a challenge for a lot of families.
That's something to navigate. Yeah, my background is actually in clinical psychology, and most of my research was around marital satisfaction and things like that. And so we did a lot of marital counseling, and yeah, it's tough across the board. But that's dealing with two different sets of expectations or just approaches. It adds a whole other layer onto it for sure. But even just asking some of the questions that we talked about today with your partner, in addition to the professionals, might be an interesting conversation starter.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. And again, if you have questions, you're welcome to email Katie directly, or if you didn't get her email address written down, you can send those to me and I am happy to forward those questions on to her.
So that you have it there. There it is.
Excellent.
I don't know if it's a link or not, but okay. Well, thanks, Meg. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you. Well, everybody have a great Tuesday, and I hope to catch you at our presentation on Thursday evening from 7 to 8 on skill building across the lifespan. So we'll see you all hopefully on Thursday, and thank you so much, Katie.
Awesome. No problem. Bye, guys.